Explorers need to know two things: where they are and where they are heading. This is called navigation. Marine navigation, especially beyond the visible shores, requires a reference from which the boat direction can be measured. True north has been used traditionally as this reference, but its direction was difficult to establish for centuries. At night, Polaris, the polar star, can be used in the Northern Hemisphere if it's not hidden behind clouds. During the day, the sun is of some help, but its movement across the sky makes it difficult to use, except at noon, when it is highest above the horizon. At that moment, south is exactly in the direction of the sun. For navigators sailing in the Southern Hemisphere and south of the tropics, the sun at noon is due north. Around 400 BC, the Chinese noticed that lozenge-shaped lengths of the iron mineral lodestone tended to line up approximately towards the North Star when placed on a small wooden platform floating in a bowl of water. A few hundred years later, during the Han Dynasty, Chinese navigators were using a spoon carved out of lodestone, the handle of which would point south, resting on a form of compass card. The Venetians are usually credited with developing the practical application of these magnetic properties to determine direction at sea. In the 13th century, the first floating compass roses were used on Venetian ships. Throughout the 18th and 19th centuries, the newly formed scientific societies spent much time and effort in studying the Earth's magnetic field, both from pure scientific and also very practical reasons. At any place upon the Earth, a freely suspended magnet will take up a position with respect to three axes: geographic north, geographic east, and a line vertically downwards. The horizontal angle between a magnetic needle and geographic north is termed the variation or declination. The vertical angle between the needle and the local horizontal plane is termed inclination or dip. The dip is measured by an immensely delicate instrument called a dip circle. In 1834, geologist Robert Weir Fox developed a more robust version to use for exploring for deposits of copper and tin in Cornwall. The Fox dipping needle was found to be suitable for use in the challenging environment at sea. Magnetic lines of force are imaginary lines used to visualize the direction and strength of a magnetic field, essentially showing the path a tiny magnetic needle would follow if placed within the field. They always extend from the North Pole of a magnet to the South Pole and never cross each other, with denser lines indicating a stronger magnetic field. The magnetic field of our planet is driven by the Earth's inner core, which is a ball of solid iron about 1,200 kilometres in diameter, surrounded by a liquid outer core of mostly iron and nickel. These act as a giant magnet. Currents in the liquid core cause irregularities in the magnetic field, which, combined with the Earth's rotation, constantly alter the magnetic lines of force, manifested by the movement of the north and south magnetic poles. Since it was first discovered in 1831, the North Magnetic Pole has drifted more than 1,100 kilometres towards the geographic North Pole, while the South Magnetic Pole has drifted even further in the same period away from the geographic South Pole. This irregular drift of the magnetic poles created serious problems for the 18th and 19th century navigators, reliant as they were on the magnetic compass. In the early 1800s, the magnetic elements across much of the inhabited world were being mapped, and magnetic observatories were being established worldwide. However, values were ill-defined across the oceans, as few ships sailed with equipment for collecting magnetic data, nor were measurements easily made on board a vessel underway. The quest for the precise location of the magnetic poles had become an obsession, especially for the British, who mounted the British Magnetic Scheme, which has been nicknamed the Magnetic Crusade. As part of this, in 1829, an expedition led by Sir John Ross, sponsored by the gin magnate Felix Booth, set out to find the North Magnetic Pole. During this trip, a small party led by John's nephew, James Clark Ross, located the position of the North Magnetic Pole on the 1st of June 1831 on a peninsula in the far north of Canada, which he named after Felix Booth. James Ross personally planted the British flag at the pole. James Clark Ross had joined the Royal Navy at the age of 12 in 1812 under the sponsorship of his uncle. The discovery of the pole brought him fame and promotion. By 1834 he had been promoted to captain. From 1835 to 1838, James Ross was one of the principal participants in the British Magnetic Survey of Great Britain and Ireland, working with prominent physicists and geologists under Sir Edward Sabine. In 1838, the British Association for the Advancement of Science proposed an expedition to carry out magnetic measurements in the Antarctic, strongly supported by the Royal Society, the principal advisors to the government. The proposal was approved. Given his outstanding polar and magnetic exploration experience, Captain James Clark Ross was the obvious choice to lead the expedition. On the 8th of April 1839, Captain Ross was formally appointed. The Royal Navy assigned HMS Erebus of 370 tons and HMS Terror of 340 tons, two unusually strong warships, to the expedition. Both were bomb ships, equipped to fire heavy mortar bombs at a high angle over defences, and were accordingly heavily built to withstand the substantial recoil of these enormous weapons. Their solid construction ideally suited them for use in dangerous sea ice that might crush other ships. The first of this class of vessel, HMS Hecla, had been used by Lieutenant William Parry in 1819 in his search for the Northwest Passage, and they became a popular choice for polar exploration. Ross selected his friend Commander Francis Rawdon Moira Crozier to command HMS Terror. Both ships carried a complement of 64 persons, including 12 officers. In 1812, Brian Donkin had acquired the patent for preserving food in metal cans. he set up a canning factory in Bermondsey, the first to use steel cans coated in tin, and quickly became the major supplier of tinned food to the Royal Navy. Ross stocked his ships with 15 tons of tinned meat, 6.7 tons of tinned vegetables, 2.7 tons of soup and 2 tons of gravy, plus 1.2 tons of cranberries, 4.4 tons of pickled walnuts, onions and cabbage, 280 kilograms of mustard and 50 kilograms of pepper. He estimated this would be sufficient for 4 years, if supplemented by restocking en route and fresh seal meat while in Antarctica. On the 14th of September 1839, Ross received his detailed instructions, signed by the Earl of Minto, First Lord of the Admiralty. The instructions included a manifesto of 77 pages setting out precisely the studies to be undertaken in relation to physics, meteorology, geology and mineralogy, botany and vegetable physiology, and of zoology and animal physiology. The subject of most importance beyond all question, to which the attention of Captain James Clark Ross and his officers were directed be turned, and that which they must consider as, in an emphatic manner, the great scientific object of the expedition, was that of terrestrial magnetism. Scientific observations were to be made daily throughout the expedition. In addition, fixed magnetic observatories were to be established at St. Helena Island and Cape Town, as well as in a new observatory to be established by Ross in Hobart, Tasmania. Ross assigned responsibility for the geological and zoological studies to Robert McCormick and John Robertson, the surgeons for HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, respectively. Dr. Joseph Dalton Hooker, the 21-year-old newly graduated assistant surgeon on HMS Erebus, was given responsibility for the botanical work. Hooker's comprehensive collections and subsequent publications of his plant descriptions from this expedition made his reputation as a leading botanist. He became one of the most distinguished and lauded scientists of his era. Appointed in 1865 as director of the Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew, he held the position for 20 years. After undergoing extensive refits to equip them for the arduous voyage and loading up in London, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror sailed down the Thames to Margate on the 25th of September 1839, where unfavourable winds delayed their departure until the 30th of September. From the Channel and across the Bay of Biscay to Madeira, where they arrived on the 20th of October, daily and sometimes hourly scientific observations were made, as well as depth soundings. 11 days were fruitfully spent in Madeira. Detailed observations of magnetic dip, variation and intensity were made, the chronometers checked, and the height of the highest mountain on the island measured accurately to within a metre of today's estimate. The ships stocked up with tropical fruits, tea and coffee grown on the island, and, of course, Madeira wine. The ships departed on the 31st of October, just ahead of a storm, and docked briefly at Santa Cruz on the Canary Islands 2 days later to land mail for carriage back to England. A few days later, they caught the northeast trade winds and made good time to the Cape Verde Islands, anchoring at Port Praia on the 14th of November. Land observations were made once again to check the chronometers. Livestock, fresh fruit, vegetables and water were procured, although the water turned out to be of poor quality. Livestock, fresh fruit, vegetables and water were procured, although the water turned out to be of poor quality. Leaving Port Praia on the 20th of November, the ships reverted to hourly meteorological observations as they approached the equator in order to track the movements of the winds around the equatorial region. Steering for St. Paul's Rocks, which lie in the mid-Atlantic almost on the equator, Ross landed there on 29th of November with some difficulty owing to the high swells and surf. Staying only long enough to take magnetic readings of variation and dip, as well as compile a rough sketch of the tiny islands and collect some rock samples, the expedition departed after a few hours. The expedition's geologist, Robert McCormick, confirmed that Charles Darwin was correct in noting during the cruise of the Beagle in 1832 that, unusually, these small islands were not volcanic, but were instead formed by a geological uplift. It is the sole location in the Atlantic Ocean where abyssal mantle is exposed above sea level, and in that respect is similar to the subantarctic Macquarie Island, south of Tasmania. The islets expose serpentinized abyssal mantle peridotite atop the world's highest mid-ocean ridge. Crossing the equator on the 3rd of December, the ships headed south to locate the magnetic equator, where the dip would be 0, crossing this point on the 7th of December. Continuing to track south, they crossed the line of least magnetic intensity on the 16th of December, and next day arrived at the Brazilian island of Trinidad. Here, Ross, Crozier and several officers were rowed ashore at Northwest Bay, landing near Nine Pin Rock, an impressive columnar basalt column. Because the whole island was composed of highly magnetic basalt, they found that taking magnetic readings was practically useless. Returning to the ships after less than 12 hours on shore, the expedition set a southerly course once more, and continuing the daily meteorological readings and depth soundings, they recrossed the line of least magnetic intensity on the 8th of January. Ross had inadvertently discovered the first evidence for what is now termed the South Atlantic anomaly, a unique location on Earth where the magnetic field is weaker than normal. This region has drawn a lot of attention because its weakened magnetic field brings the inner Van Allen radiation belt unusually close to the Earth's surface, posing a threat to spacecraft and satellites passing through it. On the 31st of January 1840, the expedition arrived at the tropical volcanic island of St. Helena, anchoring off the capital, Jamestown. The chief purpose of the visit was to establish a permanent magnetic observatory, with a party of 4 Army engineers being landed to carry this out. A spot near the house that had been built in 1815 to confine the exiled Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte was selected, and the occupation granted by the Lieutenant Governor, Lieutenant General Middlemore. Napoleon had remained in Longwood House on St. Helena until his death from liver failure in May 1821. He was buried in the grounds, but his body later exhumed and taken to Paris for reburial near the present-day Eiffel Tower. Having completed his obligation to initiate the construction of the new magnetic observatory, Ross set sail on the 9th of February and proceeded on the voyage, continuing the daily routine of magnetic, meteorological and depth soundings, the deepest being 2,677 fathoms, or 4,896 metres, taken on the 3rd of March. Forced by the prevailing winds to take an indirect route, as square-rigged ships could not sail into the wind, the expedition eventually reached Cape Town, anchoring in Simon's Bay on the 17th of March after a 6-month journey from London. The Admiralty had ordered Ross to establish a magnetic observatory at Cape Town. Lieutenant Eardley Wilmot, with 3 Army engineers and 2 others, disembarked HMS Erebus with the instruments to be set up in the observatory. Wilmot wrote to the director of the existing astronomical observatory requesting that he be able to share the site. With considerable reluctance, eventually the director agreed. Wilmot set about constructing the buildings, which comprised the magnetic observatory, a building to house the equipment to measure intensity, and another to monitor dip, all constructed of timber and non-magnetic fastenings. In addition, a wind tower for meteorological observations and quarters for the men were built, as they were to remain on site for at least the next 4 years. The rest of the expedition stayed at Simon's Bay only 3 weeks, long enough to replenish their stores and provisions before departing on the 6th of April for Hobart, Tasmania. Bad weather overnight separated the 2 ships. They would not meet up again for another 5 weeks. 2 weeks later, Ross arrived at the sub-Antarctic Prince Edward Islands, named in 1772 by Captain Cook, noting the abundance of king penguins but unable to find a safe place to land. Naming Cape Crozier and Cape Hooker, he sailed on for the Crozet Islands. Ross had been asked by a merchant in Cape Town to carry some provisions to a party of sealers located on Possession Island. HMS Erebus arrived off Penguin or Inaccessible Island on the 26th of April. The island was well named, whichever label was used, as the rugged shores were literally covered with penguins, while Ross could not find any place where it would be safe to land. Similarly, Pig Island to the north proved also to be inaccessible, so Erebus bore away for Possession Island. The Crozet Islands had been discovered on the 24th of January 1772 by the expedition of French explorer Marc-Joseph Marian Dufresne aboard Le Masserine. His second-in-command, Julien-Marie Crozet, landed on Ile de la Possession, claiming the archipelago for France. The expedition continued east and landed in New Zealand, where Captain Dufresne and much of his crew were killed and eaten by Maoris. Crozet survived the disaster, successfully leading the survivors back to their base in Mauritius. For Ross, the weather as usual in these latitudes was atrocious. It took Ross 3 days to navigate to a bay in the northeast of the island which might have offered a safe landing spot. By firing several guns as Erebus stood close to shore, they were able to attract the attention of the sealers, who lit a smoky fire in recognition. However, the gales prevented any further communication until the weather abated on the 1st of May. Erebus once again stood off America Bay while the sealers launched a boat and came aboard. They were a sorry lot, as the sea elephant population had been almost wiped out years previously, so they had little catch to show for the 3 years that the 11 men had been there. After transferring the provisions to the sealers, with the wind coming from the east and rising, Ross quickly hoisted sail and left for a quick survey of East Island before setting course for Kerguelen Island. On the 5th of May 1840, when at latitude 47 degrees south en route to Kerguelen, Erebus encountered another Antarctic iceberg, albeit a very small one, only 6 metres high. Next day the ship passed Bligh's Cap, but storms blew them past the island. It took 6 days to beat back against the wind to the entrance to Christmas Harbour, but the wind was still too strong to enter safely. HMS Terror arrived on the 13th of May, but it took another 2 days before the wind died enough for both ships to reach safe anchorage at the head of the harbour. For the next 2 months the expedition thoroughly explored the island, mapping the interior and charting the coast, while a continuous hourly series of magnetic observations were recorded. During 45 of the 68 days spent in Christmas Harbour, the wind blew with gale force, while there were only 3 days in which neither snow nor rain fell. My video Subantarctic Kerguelen tells a lot more about the Kerguelen archipelago, including the work of the Ross expedition. On the 20th of July they departed what Ross called this most dreary and disagreeable harbour and headed for Hobart. The seas were so huge that waves regularly broke over the decks. On the 30th of July the boatswain, named Roberts, was swept overboard and drowned. Dodging the occasional small iceberg added to the hazard. Riding the westerly winds of the roaring 40s, the ships averaged 260 kilometres per day for the 23-day journey of about 6,000 kilometres, anchoring at the head of the Derwent River on the 16th of August. The next day they anchored off Fort Mulgrave. Ross went ashore and was warmly welcomed by his good friend the Lieutenant Governor, Sir John Franklin, another famous Arctic explorer, and his wife. Anxious to start work on the observatory he had been instructed to construct, Ross, accompanied by Franklin, chose a spot close to the government domain, near the site of the proposed new government house, located on a bed of clean, non-magnetic sandstone at least 15 metres thick. The prefabricated sections of the observatory had been sent out earlier from England and were ready for speedy erection. A party of 200 convicts were assigned to the task. The building was completed in 9 days, with magnetic observations commencing on the 27th of August. Other buildings, including an astronomical and a meteorological observatory, were speedily added. During this time, Ross received news of the Antarctic discoveries made by the French expedition under Dumont d'Urville and the United States exploring expedition under Lieutenant Wilkes. These expeditions are discussed in my videos on subantarctic New Zealand. Wilkes had left for Ross in Hobart a long letter report and tracing of his first draft of his chart of Antarctica. Ross was deeply distressed to find that both these expeditions had chosen to explore the very section of Antarctica that he had intended to investigate. Consequently, Ross felt justified in ignoring the instructions of those who had financed his voyage and selected a far more easterly longitude, 170 degrees east, to follow southwards and hopefully find the South Magnetic Pole. By the 12th of November 1840, the ships had been fully repaired, provisions restocked, and the expedition was ready for sea. At noon that day, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror cleared the Derwent, entered Storm Bay, and commenced their journey to the Auckland Islands. 8 days later, Northwest Cape was sighted. Rounding the north coast of Enderby Island, Ross entered the harbour, later named after him, anchoring at 1 p.m. on the 20th of November. The fruitful 3 weeks that the expedition, and especially Dr. Hooker, spent in Auckland Island are described in my video on Auckland Island. Similarly, the 4 days spent on Campbell Island, where they arrived on the 13th of December after an overnight journey from Auckland Island, are covered in my video on Campbell Island. From Campbell Island, Ross set course due south as planned, encountering their first iceberg on the 27th of December. That evening, over 15 large tabular icebergs were sighted, up to 60 metres high and 3 kilometres across. 10 days later, they reached the outer edge of the ice pack, beating their way through until on the 8th of January 1841 they entered open water in what is now named the Ross Sea. At 2 a.m. on the 11th of January, land was sighted. The highest mountain, Ross named Mount Sabine, after the Foreign Secretary of the Royal Society. In the evening, the ships approached a prominent cape which Ross named Cape Adair, after his friend Viscount Adair. The mountains behind it Ross named the Admiralty Range, individual peaks being named after the various lords of the Admiralty. The ships then turned south and followed the coast down to a group of small islands. Ross, Crozier, and several officers were rowed ashore. There, on the 12th of January 1841, Captain James Clark Ross planted the British flag, taking possession on behalf of Queen Victoria of Great Britain, witnessed by thousands of Adelie penguins. No doubt the 22-year-old Queen was delighted to have another splash of red added to the world map showing the empire on which the sun never set. Incredibly, not once throughout his forays into Antarctic waters did Ross or any of his crews set foot on the Antarctic continent. Like D'Urville, he only managed to land on offshore islands. This may have coloured his view that Antarctica was not a continent, but merely a collection of islands. Ross ignored the many hundreds of depth soundings and bottom samples collected by the 4 ships of the Wilkes expedition, which proved the existence of a distinct continental shelf, a defining criterion for a continent. Continuing south, Ross named the various peaks and features to the west after members of the Royal Society and the British Association, sponsors and financiers of his expedition. Reaching Coolman Island, which Ross named after his wife's father, Thomas Coolman, Ross was surprised to find pieces of coral among the debris collected in his bottom samples. A brief spell of fine weather and wind from the north helped the ship speed south. Large masses of ice extending out from the land for up to 50 kilometres prevented them from getting close to the shore, although a volcanic edifice the crew called Mount Etna was clearly visible. Ross named it Mount Melbourne after the Prime Minister, Viscount Melbourne, at the time the expedition was proposed. Attempts to sail westward towards the land were thwarted by the heavy ice, so the ships pushed on with a southerly course, reaching an island on the 27th of January. At 5 p.m, while HMS Erebus was within 3 or 4 kilometres of the island, Ross left the ship, accompanied by several officers, while Commander Crozier did likewise in a whaleboat from HMS Terror. The surf was too dangerous for the boat carrying Ross to land, so he crossed into Crozier's more robust whaleboat, and they made it close to shore. With great difficulty, Ross and some of the officers jumped onto some rocks and quickly took possession of the island, which he named after his good friend Sir John Franklin. Snatching a few rock specimens, they reboarded the whaleboat, soaked to the skin and painfully cold, rowing back to HMS Erebus, which they reached by 9 p.m. The rocks were eventually deposited in the British Museum collection and forgotten for 150 years. Soon after midnight, Ross sighted a vigorous eruption commencing from the high island he had seen the previous day. Astonished to find an active volcano in such a far south latitude, Ross named it Mount Erebus, and an adjacent volcanic peak he named Mount Terror. A small island between Franklin Island and the High Island, Ross named Beaufort Island, after Captain Francis Beaufort, RN, hydrographer to the Admiralty. As he approached, Ross perceived a low white line extending from the eastern point of the High Island as far as the eye could see to the east. Coming closer, it proved to be a perpendicular cliff of ice, up to 60 metres high, perfectly flat on top, with no fissures or projections on the face. Naming the two capes he could see, Cape Bird and Cape Crozier, Ross decided to follow the ice barrier to the east, favoured by a fresh breeze from the northwest. By next morning, the ships had sailed over 180 kilometres along the ice wall. The wind dropped, but they were able to increase their distance from the barrier to around 25 kilometres to counter the northerly swell that was pushing them into the ice. Soundings showed the water depth close to the barrier to be almost 700 metres, so Ross concluded the ice must be floating and not grounded on land. The ships continued on to the east at a safe distance well away from the ice wall, which they could see from time to time through the snow showers, while dodging the numerous icebergs that had broken away from the barrier. On the 31st of January 1841, having travelled 500 kilometres along the Great Ice Barrier, the ships ran into heavy pack ice. They managed to penetrate over 20 kilometres when it became too hard to push any further. Retreating back to open water, they weaved back and forth through loose ice until on the 5th of February they reached longitude 167 degrees west, where they met impenetrable pack ice. This was their furthest point east of Cape Crozier. Bashing through the ice had taken its toll on the ship's hulls, stripping much of the copper sheathing. Ross called it quits, turning back west. Back in open sea and observing clear water to the south, Ross decided to have one more look at the ice wall. At 5:30 a.m. on the 9th of February, HMS Erebus sailed within 500 metres of the barrier, entering an embayment within the ice wall, which sloped down to a height of only 15 metres, thus affording Ross a view of the smooth upper surface, which he described as an immense plain of frosted silver. Gigantic icicles descended from the perpendicular cliffs, indicating that at times it was warm enough to partially melt the ice wall. Ross never named the immense ice shelf. The term Great Ice Barrier crept in later. John Edward Davis, second master of HMS Terror, referred to it in a letter dated February 1842 as the Ice Barrier, while his sketches, which were used by Ross to illustrate his own account of the voyage, labelled it the South Polar Barrier. Robert McCormick, surgeon to HMS Erebus, illustrated his account of the voyage with sketches showing the Great Barrier. This name stuck for the next 100 years. Gradually the term Ross Ice Shelf came into use. In 1956, that became the official geographic name. With the wind blowing masses of pancake ice into the bay, the ships quickly retreated to the northwest, then north along the edge of the pack ice to try and find another passage to the east. Unsuccessful in this quest, Ross turned west and headed back towards Franklin Island to make a final attempt at locating the South Magnetic Pole, of which he estimated, since the magnetic dip was 91 degrees, to be 670 kilometres to the west of his current position on the 11th of February. On the 17th of February, Ross entered the head of a gulf he named McMurdo Bay, after the senior lieutenant of HMS Terror, Archibald William McMurdo. The pack ice was so thick that Ross and Crozier agreed that it was hopeless to make any further attempt to reach the South Magnetic Pole this late in the season. Setting course for Hobart, Ross added a few more names to the Antarctic Gazetteer as he went, including the Prince Albert Range for Queen Victoria's consort, and Cape Washington, after John Washington, RN, who succeeded Francis Beaufort as hydrographer to the Admiralty. As he proceeded north, staying as close to the coast as he dared, and busily naming every feature after sundry officers of the two ships, Ross decided to make another attempt to land at Cape Adare. If he had succeeded, Ross would have preempted by 52 years the first deliberate landing on the continent by Carsten Borchgrevink at Cape Adare in 1895. Unfortunately, the fast ice extending at least 15 kilometres from shore prevented his ambition. Steering northwest, naming another 10 capes and inlets after members of his crew, Ross ran into more ice. Forced to run back to the east, fortunately they had stood well off from shore because the wind died away and they were at the mercy of a heavy swell from the southeast. Ross observed an enormous mass of ice covering the high ground he had named after John Davis, the second master of HMS Erebus. To avoid being trapped in the sea ice, he was forced to stand off again to the northeast, well away from the land. This at least gave the ships the opportunity to replenish the water supply from the numerous icebergs that surrounded them. From there the ships struggled north through the pack ice, seeing numerous whales. Just before midnight on the last day of February, Ross saw for the first time the Aurora Australis. On the 3rd of March, the Balleny Islands were sighted. Ross had no inclination to approach them, as pack ice and numerous icebergs would have made such a venture too dangerous. On the evening of the next day, the Antarctic Circle was crossed. The sea was still full of loose ice and icebergs, keeping all hands in a state of anxious vigilance throughout the night. These difficult conditions prevailed until the 21st of March, when the ships finally cleared the sea ice, although many large icebergs were still to be seen until the Antarctic convergence was crossed at the end of the month. Throughout this period, the Aurora Australis was in full display, with many colour variations being observed. At 10:30 a.m. on the 6th of April, the coast of Tasmania came in sight. Storm Bay was entered that evening, and by noon next day the ships were moored off Rossbank Observatory. For the following 3 months the expedition remained in Hobart, repairing and refitting the ships, maintaining observations at Rossbank, while Hooker, McCormick and other officers explored the hinterland. The ships then sailed to Sydney to compare magnetic readings between Hobart and Port Jackson. Ross was surprised by the intensity of the rainfall, measuring a maximum of 280 millimetres in the 24 hours to the 17th of July. On completion of the magnetic observations, the ships sailed for New Zealand on the 5th of August, arriving at the Bay of Islands 12 days later for a further series of magnetic and meteorological observations. Departing on the 23rd of November, Ross set course for the Chatham Islands to make more magnetic readings. Deeming it too risky to land when he got there, Ross turned south and headed once again for the Great Ice Barrier. Favoured by benign weather, the ships made good progress. The first icebergs were spotted at 5:30 a.m. on the 16th of December. Ross changed course to head south along the 150 west longitude, 500 kilometres further east of the longitude he had achieved at the beginning of the year. Pack ice was encountered the next day, along with 40 or more large tabular icebergs. Altering course to the southwest, they managed to make reasonable progress amongst many whales. By Christmas Eve, the pack had closed in and they were trapped. Nevertheless, they managed to do justice to a fine English Christmas feast, which Ross had taken care to preserve for the occasion. The ships remained imprisoned in the ice for the next 5 weeks, while the crews occupied themselves hunting seals and penguins. Just after midnight on the 20th of January, violent gales and huge waves dashed the ships against the icebergs with such force that they almost tore away the rudder of HMS Terror and severely damaged the rudder of HMS Erebus. The storm lasted until the 21st of January, when the ships were at last able to secure themselves to ice floes and effect repairs, which took 3 days to achieve. Fortunately, both ships carried a spare rudder. That for HMS Terror was installed by the 25th of January. Nevertheless, the ships remained prisoners of the ice until the 2nd of February, when, at last, after 56 days in the pack, they broke free. Ross was determined to take another look at the Great Ice Barrier, but further east than he had reached previously. Skirting along the western edge of the ice, dodging the numerous icebergs, the ships inched their way south until the 22nd of February, when the barrier was spotted from the masthead just before midnight. Gingerly entering an embayment in the barrier, at 7 p.m. next day they reached the furthest point south of the entire voyage, 78 degrees south latitude, only 2.5 kilometres from the edge of the ice wall, which here dipped down to a height of only 32 metres above sea level. From the crow's nest, Ross saw what he called the appearance of land. Given they were only 60 kilometres west of what is now called King Edward VII Land, he was probably correct in his assumption, but unable to get close enough to prove it. Worried about becoming trapped again, given the lateness of the season, Ross ordered the ships to proceed to the Falkland Islands, where he proposed to spend the winter and refit the ships before attempting to reach a higher latitude in the Weddell Sea before heading for home in England. Early in that journey, on the 12th of March 1842, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror came close to destroying each other. Erebus was suddenly forced to turn across Terror's path in order to avoid crashing headlong into an iceberg which had just become visible through the snow. Terror couldn't clear both Erebus and the iceberg, so a collision was inevitable. The ships crashed violently together and their rigging became entangled. The impact floored the crew members while masts snapped and were torn away. The ships were locked in a destructive stranglehold at the foot of the iceberg until eventually Terror surged past the iceberg and Erebus broke free. The two ships drifted towards two icebergs some 20 metres apart. Terror passed through the first before Erebus, whose yards hit the icebergs again and again. Ross eventually sailed her through the space between the icebergs by the hazardous expedient of the sternboard. In other words, he sailed backwards, an amazing feat of seamanship. Repairs were speedily completed. The ships resumed their journey towards Cape Horn, which they rounded on the night of the 2nd of April. A few days later, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror anchored in Berkeley Sound, off Port Louis, remaining in the Falklands, where Ross established yet another magnetic observatory, from the 6th of April until the 4th of September. During September 1842, Ross set up another magnetic observatory in St. Martin's Cove, near Cape Horn, staying there to make observations until the 7th of November, when he returned to Port Louis. On the 17th of December, the ships sailed south via the South Shetland Islands in an unsuccessful attempt to penetrate the Weddell Sea. From there, Ross steered direct to the Cape of Good Hope. After spending most of April 1843 in Cape Town, Ross made his way home to England via St. Helena Ascension Island, Rio de Janeiro, skirted the Cape Verde Islands and the Azores, and on the 4th of September 1843 the ships anchored off Folkestone after 4 years away. Ross never returned to Antarctica.